boys and girls, it's Miss Queen, and today I'm here to talk to you about the narrative elements. Narrative elements are the parts of a story, right? Just like in science, when you think of the word elements, right? It's the parts, what makes something whole. So we're going to talk about the different parts of a good story. So the topics we're going to talk about and you're going to see in this presentation is theme, setting, characters, plot, and conflict. And all these things make up a good story. So let's begin by talking about theme. Now, what is theme? Theme, we know, is a message or a lesson from the story that you can apply to your own life. A theme is usually what the author wants us to learn from their story. The author will not explicitly state the theme. In other words, they're not going to tell us directly what the theme is, right? We need to make an inference on what the theme is based on what happens in the story. So based on the events and what characters learn in the story, we would come up with the theme ourselves. And keep in mind that there could be more than one theme, right? Many stories have multiple themes. Also, it is not specific to the story that we're reading. So many times students get confused with main idea and theme. And we will talk more in detail about it, and we've already mentioned it a couple of times. And I have actually created a presentation on comparing the difference between theme and main idea. So if you're confused with that, check out the YouTube video so that you can be more clear on what the difference between those two are. But usually, a theme is a statement that does not include a character's name or an event that happened in the story. Rather, it's a sentence or a statement that I can take and apply it or say that the theme is also the same theme to another story. Okay, so it could be repeated. A theme is universal and it can apply to anyone or everyone. So let's take a look at an example of theme. So we have read the story, The Invisible Boy, in this year, and we notice that there's two examples here. Now the first one says, being excluded makes Brian sad. Now this could not be a theme of the story, The Invisible Boy, because it is specific to what happens in that story. Now we know that Brian is the main character of that story, and usually I tell the students if it has a character's name, that cannot be the theme, right? That's part of like a main idea. It could be like a main event that happened in that story, but it cannot be a theme. Now look at the next example. This could be an example of a theme in this book, right? And we've already spoke about this, and there's actually multiple themes in this story, and this is one of them. So excluding people hurts their feelings. Notice that it says excluding people, right? People can apply to anyone, including ourselves, right? So this could be an example of theme because it is not specific to the story that we're reading, and it is universal and can apply to anyone. And I can even say that this could be a theme of another book that I've read. Now let's talk about setting. Many times we think, oh, setting is just the location or where and when it happens. But did you know that authors spend a lot of time developing the setting for their story? Usually, the setting also helps set the tone or the mood of the story. For instance, let's say that I wanted to write a scary story, right? I want to set the mood of, a frightening or a scary story. Now, if I was going to think of the setting for that story, I probably would not pick a sunny beach day, right? Because then that would be, it kind of sounds exciting, it sounds fun, there's probably a lot of people because it's sunny, right? And, it's at the beach. So I would not pick that setting for my story if I wanted the mood to be scary and frightening, right? Or if I wanted to write a horror story. Now, I might instead pick a forest. Maybe it's dark, it's nighttime, maybe it's October 30th, right? The day before Halloween. It could be very foggy. So that would set the mood and the tone of a scary story. So setting is so, so important. As writers, because you are all writers and readers, right? But when we write our own stories, we really need to think, okay, what is the setting going to be in my story? And we need to realize what is the mood of the story that you want to set for your readers. And that will help you come up with a good setting. So now let's take a look at these notes. So the setting describes the where and the when the story takes place. It can include the time of the day, the time of the year, right? So it could be during the spring, during the summer. It could be in the morning or the afternoon. It could be the time in history, right? Like our historical fiction books. Sometimes they take place in a historical setting. We also think of the setting, or I'm sorry, the scenery, right? Which is, it could be in a forest, it could be at the beach, anything like that. The weather as well, right? So like the example I said about setting a scary mood or scary tone, the weather might be freezing cold, or it could be even raining and foggy, right? All of that has to set the mood. And then the location, right? Where it actually happens. So the functions of a setting is that it helps build background and creates an image in the reader's minds. It helps set the tone and the mood of the story. So now let's talk about characters. Now, without characters, we would not have a story, right? Characters are so important, and there are different kinds of characters. So let's talk first about major characters, or also known as round characters. So the major and the round characters are the well-developed characters. They're the ones that we know a lot about because they have been well-developed. They have many traits, and sometimes the traits could be good or bad, right? Sometimes we could think of these characters as being 3D. Think of something that's 3D, is round. We see all its parts, right? We see the back, the top, the bottom, everything. So we see all of their sides as major characters. We know everything about them. The opposite of a major or a round character is a minor character or a flat character. These are usually the characters that are not well developed. In other words, we don't know a lot about them. Now let's take a look at protagonists. Usually the protagonists could be the main characters, right? They usually are the main characters. They're the good guys of the story, right? They're mostly the main characters. It's who the story is all about. And the opposite of a protagonist is an antagonist. So sometimes an antagonist could also be the main character of the story, right? Like for example, if you see in this on your screen, Joker, right? The Joker, he was the main character in his story, and he was the antagonist. So sometimes they could also be main characters. So the antagonists we know are like the bad guys of the story, the evil characters, the villains of the story. And sometimes, even though we might not like them, they kind of make the story interesting, right? So now let's talk about characterization. Characterization is the way that the animals are presented in the story by the author. So the author has two types of characterizations they can use. They can use direct characterization or indirect characterization. So think of the word direct. Direct means, and sometimes we use the word direct with like direct quotes, right? It means we take words directly from the text, like word by word. You can kind of connect that meaning with this as well. So a direct characterization is where the writers make direct statements about the character's personality and what they're like. So they tell us directly what the character is all about and what exactly they do and exactly how they are, exactly what they look like. They tell us everything, right? So look at this example. Mo was poor and lived in a small house with little to eat. Notice how it says he was poor. He lived in a little house. He has nothing to eat. Like, there's no inferences that we can make. The author directly tells us what this character is like, okay? Now, the opposite, an indirect characterization, the writer reveals information. They do give us information about the character's thoughts, what they say, and what they do with their actions. However, we kind of have to make inferences on their character traits or what they're like. For example, so let's take a look at this example. It's the same one with Mo, right? So instead of the character just telling, or the author just telling us he's poor, he lives in a small house, and he doesn't have much to eat, the author might say, Mo wore raggedy old clothing and begged for food. Well, I can make an inference with that. If he's wearing old clothing and he's begging for food, he probably is poor, right? And probably doesn't have much to eat. So you see how it doesn't tell me, but it does give me information that I can then later make an inference with and tell more information on this character. Okay, so now let's talk about plot. Oh my goodness, plot is so important. Plot is the action in the story, right? It's the events that happen in the story. If without events and without action, your story would be plain and simple, boring, right? So we need action. Now, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and every story needs a plot. So there's different parts. Let's take a look at the different parts of plot. Here's the plot diagram. You have seen this before. So this usually is used to go over the story, and sometimes when we are the writers of our story, right, when we're writing our stories, we have to think of, okay, well, what's the action? What's going to happen at the beginning of the story? What's going to happen in the middle of the story? And then what's going to happen at the end? How is my story going to end? How are the problems going to be resolved? So let's take a look. And this is so important also. I just want to point out that you cannot just have a problem and then the solution right away, right? That's boring. It doesn't leave your readers thinking of what might happen or what is going to happen. It's just a boring story. So you do need those events in the middle, right? That's where the rising action and the falling action comes in. So let's take a look at this diagram. So pretend this is like a mountain. We're climbing up the mountain. We're going to start right here where my mouse is on the exposition. The exposition of the story is the start of the story. It's before the action happens. Usually there's not a lot of action in the exposition. It introduces the setting, it will introduce the characters, and as the reader, we are also able to see what the tone of the story is going to be. Is it going to be a scary or a spooky story? Or is it just going to be a plain, normal, maybe fiction story? Okay? Now let's go up our mountain. We're going up, climb, climb. This is the rising action. Okay? These are the series of events that it could also be the conflicts already. This is like where the problems begin, right? And these are the events that lead to the climax. There could be more than one, okay? More than one event in the rising action. So let's keep going up our mountain. We've reached the top of the mountain. This is the climax of the story. It's the turning point. It is the most intense moment of the story, and it can happen either mentally or in action. Usually I tell the students, this part of the story, as readers, we didn't expect it to happen. It's that moment that as we're reading the story, it's like we think, oh man, this is getting good, right? We didn't expect it to happen. Sometimes the characters in the story are kind of left in awe too. That can be another clue to figure out what the climax is, where the characters in the story themselves didn't expect something to happen, right? They're in shock. And now let's come down our mountain. We're finishing our hike. Coming down to the falling action. Think of it falling because you're falling down the mountain, right? So the falling action is where all of the action which follows the climax, right? So all the events that follow the climax, and it leads to the end or the solution of the problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a solution right away, right? But sometimes characters will try to solve the problem, right? And they are not successful at it. They failed at it. So they have to do something else to solve the problem. That's all part of falling action. And that's what makes a story interesting, right? You don't want to just have a problem and then the character is so smart that it resolves the problem right away. No, sometimes you need more events in between there. So now that we're done with our hike, we have reached the resolution of the story. The resolution is the conclusion of the story. It's the tying together of all the threads. So if there are any unanswered questions, they usually get answered or resolved in the end, right? Or in the resolution. All the problems are resolved. All right, now let's talk about conflict. Conflict is a fancy word for problem, right? And every story needs to have conflict. It's sad to say, but readers, and we can even connect these narrative elements with movies as well, right? We want to see drama. We want to see conflicts because that's what makes the story interesting. So conflicts are the battle or the struggle between two forces, right? And it doesn't always have to be necessarily bad. Sometimes conflicts are just, problems that you need to resolve, but they're not bad. Okay? Sometimes they create a change in a character, and that's where the theme comes in, right? What do they learn? And without conflict, of course, there's no plot and there's really no events. So let's take a look at the different kinds of conflicts that there are. So there are internal conflicts and there are external conflicts. Okay, and on your screen you see a couple of examples of each. So think of the word internal. Notice how it has the word in, right? Usually an internal conflict happens in a character's mind, right? So we'll talk about that once we get to that one. But then we have external conflicts. Think of the word external as the word exit. Usually these conflicts happen outside of the character's ability, or it's out of their control. Okay, so now let's take a look. Notice there's 4. So we have character versus character, character versus society, character versus nature, and then character versus self. So let's look at character versus character first. Character versus character is an example of an external conflict because a character is having a problem with another character in the story, right? So you can't control somebody else's actions, so it is an external conflict. Let's look at the example. A boss fires an employee. So obviously the boss and the employee have a conflict. It doesn't mean that they're fighting, right? Conflict doesn't always mean something bad or that they're fighting. But now this employee is out of a job. So to him, this is a problem and he got fired. So he's having a conflict with another character. Now let's take a look at character versus nature. This is also an example of an external conflict because guess what? Unfortunately, we cannot control nature, right? I wish we could. That would be pretty awesome. But we can't control when it rains, when it snows, when it's sunny. So it's out of our control, so it is an external conflict. So this type of example is when there's a problem with the force of nature. So an example, a family is stranded in a snowstorm. So there's a snowstorm, they can't get out of their house, they're blocked in. This is a problem for them, right? And it's a problem because of nature. Next example, let's come up here, character versus society. Now, when we think of society, I want you to think of like the law, think of the community which you live in, think of the culture, so it could be like religious, things like that. So when a character is having a problem with anything that has to do with the laws or beliefs of a group or anything like that, this is also an external conflict because again, it's something you can't control. You can't control the law. You can't control the community and what they do or what they have to follow. So this is an external conflict. Let's look at this example. A woman is late for work and runs a red light. So maybe the cops pulled her over and gave her a ticket, right? Now, running a red light is obviously against the law. So she's having a problem with the society, right? Next example, and this is actually the only example that is internal. So this is character versus self. So the character's having a problem with themselves. Now, I know you've probably watched movies where there's a character trying to make a decision, and sometimes you see like the devil on one shoulder, right, and the angel on the other, and they're kind of going back and forth. No, you shouldn't do this. No, yes, you should do this, right? They're going back and forth. That's a perfect example for this, character versus self. So the character's trying to make a decision on what to do, and he's having a struggle making the decision. So it's internal because it happens in the character's mind, right? They're the ones you could control yourself, so it happens in the mind. So let's look at the example. A teenager is torn between ditching school with her friends and staying to take a test in a class that she is failing. So she's torn between making the decision. I hope she makes the decision of staying in class, right? Because we don't ditch school. But this is an example of character versus self. And that is it, boys and girls. If you have any questions, make sure you let me know on Google Classroom.